Trans Indoctrination and No Dumbest Bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the Millennial today that, of course, is joining me is Christopher Hopkins, our producer. Thank you, podcast listeners, for listening. This podcast is titled Trans Indoctrination. And I just want you to know something. While we don't have a Dumbest Bill today, we're going to have a repeat of a Dumbest Bill tomorrow because the Right to Sit Act is going to actually have a bill hearing today. And we'll be able to hear from the sponsor himself from the actual hearing when we talk about the Right to Sit Act tomorrow. First up, Transgender Indoctrination. Folks, happening in a school near you, a public school, of course, near you, is some unusual healthcare classes that are teaching your children some pretty crazy things. A California mother has claimed that the teachers manipulated her daughter to change her gender identity. So, reporting in the New York Post, a California mother said her daughter's teachers are predatory and disgusting after she filed a lawsuit against them and the school district officials that alleged two teachers brainwashed her preteen, not even a teenager, to secretly change her gender. Jessica Conan filed the suit last week against teachers Lori Caldera and Kelly Baraki at the Spreckles Union School District for allegedly manipulating her 7th grade daughter to change her identity, her gender identity, that is, under the guise of the district's parental secret policy, where teachers could counsel students about their gender confusion and assert a new gender identity without ever notifying the parents. In one of her shocking claims, Conan said the two teachers actively sought out students who they thought were struggling with their identities and invited them to the school's Equality Club. According to the suit, all the Equality Club meetings, Ms. Caldera, at all of the meetings, Mrs. Caldera, the teacher, and Ms. Baraki, the other teacher, would coach students on LGBT plus identities such as homosexuality, bisexuality, transgenderism, gender nonconformity, etc., and how to express those identities. In other words, the two teachers were coaching the students. Coaching. Ms. Caldera and Ms. Baraki, the teachers, would instruct students to research a particular topic and then have follow-up discussions with the students about that research. Sometimes Mrs. Caldera and Ms. Baraki would introduce and push LGBT plus identities on students that the students actually resisted. The lawsuit also claims the two teachers tried to hide the students' participation in the club by not keeping track of attendance at the club's meetings, which were usually held during lunch. Conan is suing for infliction of emotional distress, negligence, civil conspiracy, and violating her federal and constitutional statutory rights to direct her daughter's upbringing by manipulating the preteen to believe she was transgender. My daughter, quote, I love her and she deserves justice, Conan told Fox News' Laura Ingraham in an interview. Quote, my family's already gone through so much and nobody else needs to go through this. You know, you wouldn't expect a teacher to be predatory towards a child, that they're supposed to be trusted. They stepped out of their line. In 7th grade, you find out that there's secrets, there are lies. Their tactics are disgusting. I feel as a mom disturbed by this because it is my right to parent her, and they took that right away from me, said the mom. The teachers had a meeting with Conan and the child to discuss gender identity. Conan said she tried to support her daughter and gave the school permission to use a boy's name for attendance. However, Conan said she decided to take action after leaked audio from the California Teachers Association's LGBTQ+ conference which allegedly showed Baraki and Caldera discussing their methods of running the club without parents' knowledge of their kids' participation. Quote, when we were doing our virtual learning, we totally stalked what they were doing on Google. When they weren't doing schoolwork, Baraki said in their recording, according to the AP. One of them was Googling Trans Day of Visibility, and we were like, check. We're going to invite that kid when we get back on campus. Spreckles Union Elementary School District Superintendent Eric Tarallo refused to comment on Conan's lawsuit, but said Caldera and Baraki, the teachers, will remain on administrative leave pending an independent investigation. Quote, the claim submitted by Mrs. Conan will be addressed in the appropriate manner within the judicial system, the superintendent said. We are currently reviewing and updating our policy and procedures regarding student clubs and will bring those draft policies to the Board of Ed as soon as feasible. Caldera has since said the quotes were taken out of context and the stalking comment was only a joke. Both she and Baraki were placed on administrative leave in November. Officials with the California Teachers Association have criticized the group Center for American Liberty, which is backing Conan in her lawsuit. So here's what the teachers union said. We are concerned about a political climate right now in which outside political forces fuel chaos and misinformation and seek to divide parents, educators, and school communities for their own political gain, which is evident in this complaint, spokesman for the teachers union, Lisa Gardner, said. She further said, the Center for American Liberty is concerned with pushing its own political agenda through litigation and has filed multiple lawsuits against various school districts and communities. So, podcast listeners, it says here again, the teachers union, Lisa Gardner representatives, her name's Lisa Gardner, she's the representative of the teachers union. She said, we the teachers union are concerned about a political climate right now in which outside political forces fuel chaos and misinformation and seek to divide parents, educators, and school communities for their own political gain. Well, here's the thing. These are not outside political forces. These are the actual parents of the children. And when you have a parent of a child who is asking about curriculum and what is being taught to their children who are preteens without parental consent, and yet that apparently is allowed in the state of California, well, guess what, podcast listeners? It's also allowed in my home state of Maryland as well. So Maryland passed a law relatively recently that allows children as young as the age of 12, which is ironically the same age as this girl in California, to receive counseling in school about transgenderism and about potentially, if not actually, receiving puberty blockers and other kinds of treatments from the public school without parental consent. Somehow, we the people have allowed legislators and legislatures to pass bills that take parental rights away in this space. And so that's why we're calling this podcast Trans Indoctrination, because it's not just that it's happening in the largest state in the country, California, but it's happening in many other blue states as well. And it could very well be even happening in your school. And you might even live in a red state because you have a teacher who has decided that they have no limits about what they can teach. Look, personally, I think this is grooming. And I think that it's basically child abuse. And I've said this before in this podcast, and I believe it now. And so in my own county, podcast listeners, in my own county, in a public high school in 9th grade, I was just sent a slide that was presented to the students in 9th grade high school health class. Okay, so it's 9th grade high school health class. So presumably these are children that are 14 years old, thereabouts. And in that health class, in my county, in a public school in 9th grade, there is a slide, and we're going to show this slide up on the podcast if you are watching on YouTube or Rumble, but I will also describe the slide. This is the actual slide that was provided. It says, cisgender privilege activity. And there's a picture of a female and a male, and the female says, sometimes it's easy to forget how good we have it. And then the female answers her own question, agreed. And then the male says, you're right. Let's try to do that less often. And the slide is referring to the fact that if you identify as the gender that you were born, so if you were a male, born a male, and you identify as such, and if you're a female and you identify as such, you have privilege. Moreover, they're calling it in the slide cisgender privilege. The most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. And then at the bottom of the slide, it says, if you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth, here are some unearned benefits from being cisgender. Read them and consider them. It's not about shame. It's about understanding. So keep in mind what they're saying is in the slide that if you were born a boy or if you were born a girl, that you have privilege because you have decided to remain as such. The most absurd slide I have ever seen. And even the so-called healthcare educator professionals put up this made-up word, cisgender. It's a made-up word. And then a made-up term, cisgender privilege. It's a made-up term. There is no such thing. There are two genders. That's it. That's it. Doesn't mean that you can't cross-dress if you want to. At least that's what we called it back in the day. Doesn't mean that you can't identify however you want to. All right? That right has existed for a long time. But instead, the healthcare class in 9th grade in my own county is teaching that there's somehow something wrong with you, and it's called privilege, because you're a guy and you dress like a guy and you're a guy. Or you're a girl and you dress like a girl and you're a girl. How dare you do that? There's something wrong with you. Literally, that is what the slide is effectively saying. And so I live in a county that is right of center. And this is happening in my county. Granted, I live in a state that's like crazy leftist nutjob blue, very much like California, but my county is not. And the state has empowered school boards, and they have empowered superintendents, and they have empowered teachers to push this crap. And it's crap. It's not education. It's indoctrination. And that's why we're calling this podcast Trans Indoctrination. Because it's not just happening in schools in California. It's probably happening across the country. And we need to pay attention to the fact that this is indeed happening. And we need to know what other slides are being presented out there. And so I ask you, podcast listeners, if you have a slide or you have some sort of presentation that was presented to your child, please provide it to us at Mark and the Millennials. You can send it to us through Facebook. You can send it to us through our email. You can send it to us any number of ways. We'll talk about it. We'll publish it. We'll put it up there on all the various social media channels that we have, because the citizens need to know that this is happening. And when you see a story in the news and it's like the mom is suing the school because the school is trying to convince, or certain teachers in the school are trying to convince a 7th grader who's 12 years old that they really aren't a girl, that they're something else, whatever that something else may be. And then they're doing this without parental consent. It is sick. And in my state, and I have no doubt in California, they have passed these laws. Certainly in my state they have. And the laws are what? The laws are that if the school believes in their own judgment that a child should receive transgender counseling of any kind, and the school believes that in its reasonable judgment that a parent ought not be notified of the same, then the school can engage in this counseling without the parent being notified. That's exactly what happened in California, and I have no doubt that it's happening here in Maryland. And parents, please pay attention. It just goes right back to the same thing. We need educational freedom, which means school choice. And I can tell you that even in certain blue counties that I'm particularly familiar with, I believe that at least 40% of the children, 40, would be removed from those public schools by parents and put in other schools, whatever those schools are, private schools, religious schools, charter schools, just something else to try it out. And I think that number could even be greater, but I think it's a minimum of 40%. And you know who a lot of the 40% is? Hispanics. Because they don't agree with this crap. And that's what the Democrats don't seem to understand, but they have to get you in public school. They have to indoctrinate you first. And that way you'll become, I don't know, a Democrat, which is, in my opinion, these days in modern America, the 21st century, it means that to be a true Democrat and to believe in slides like this means, in my opinion, that you have a mental health problem. I mean, I think that you do, to even register as a Democrat right now and think that this is okay to do without parental consent. You're the one that has the problem. So next up, podcast listeners, Peter Ducey. Oh boy, quite a Ducey. Peter Ducey, yeah, it used to be a deuce, right? You took a deuce. I digress. So Peter Ducey apparently asked a couple of questions of Joe Biden in a press conference. And, you know, why not? Obviously, Biden wants to control the narrative. By the way, all presidents want to control the narrative in press conferences. They only want to talk about what they want to talk about. It's perfectly normal. I don't blame Biden, just like I wouldn't blame anyone before him, Trump, Obama, Bush, whomever. That's what presidents do. They want to control the message, and this is the message we're going to talk about today. Well, the press dutifully played along with Biden for a while, but they're not playing along so much anymore. Peter Ducey never played along. He would always ask the tough questions. And so we have a series of clips, first up, where Peter Ducey asks a question during Biden's kind of very staged press conference. We had that clip, and here it is.
President, could you give us a brief update on your call with European leaders on what's happening in Ukraine today?
The only reason I don't like doing this is you never report on why I've called a meeting. And this is really important. I had a very, very, very good meeting, total unanimity with all the European leaders. We'll talk about it later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Will you send troops to Ukraine, sir?
Why are you sending 8,500 troops to Ukraine, possibly?
Thank you, guys.
Will you take questions on inflation then?
Let's move. Thank you. Thank you
Do you
all.
think inflation is a political liability?
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid son of a bitch.
So that was Joe Biden in a press conference who was trying to control the message, and his handlers, because, you know, Obama's really in charge. It's not Joe Biden, but Biden's handlers, who are all Obamaites, tell Joe, hey, Joe, don't answer any questions during this kind of briefing, if you will, from the press. Just keep disciplined and talk about the message that you want to talk about. And so you hear a bunch of reporters calling out, as you just heard, and they're asking questions, hoping the president will answer them, because there's a lot of bad stuff happening in the world. and certainly even more happening in the United States. And Peter Doocy, reporter from Fox News, says, well, Mr. President, will you maybe at least answer a question on inflation? And the president calls him a stupid SOB, thinking that he's not on mic, and then gives this face, podcast listeners, the president's face when he says it. He looks over at the person to his left. I couldn't see in the clip who that was. Looks over to them and gives them this like really nasty, scary kind of face. This angry face, like, how dare they ask me questions? I'm a king. You cannot ask the king a question. And a normal president, right? A normal president would address the issue of inflation, even if it's a press conference about something else. Like, yeah, of course, I'm really concerned about inflation. It's not acceptable that we have inflation that's through the roof like this, and we need to do some things to rein it in. Here are some of those things, or if you don't know what they are, how about if we do a press conference in 2 days and we talk just about that, and we really try to tackle this problem as a country? You know what? That would go a long way. But he doesn't. Of course, he doesn't. And so Peter Doocy comes on Fox News and describes the experience of being called an SOB, which apparently he didn't even know that had happened, because it kind of happened off mic, even though Biden didn't know he was still being recorded, and explains this. And we have that clip, and here it is.
The midterms. And then he said that. And I couldn't even hear him because people were shouting at us to get out. But somebody came up to me in the briefing room a few minutes later and said, did you hear what the president said? And I said, no, what? They said, he called you a stupid SOB. And I said, did he say SOB? And the person said, no.
He did the elongated version.
You know?
Koncha?
Yep. So, Doocy, I think the president's right. You are a stupid SOB.
Yeah, nobody has fact-checked him yet and said it's not true.
No one's given Pinocchios for that one. No, but
so you got to give Doocy, as well as the other reporters, like an A on laughing at themselves, right? Because it's a tough job. It's an important job that the media has to really hold presidents accountable, no matter what president it is. And by holding them accountable, what I mean is asking the tough questions of the day and not debating the president, but just asking the simple question. So Doocy there did not say, Mr. President, I think inflation is out of control, and therefore, the people of America can't afford to buy things, including stuff inside of, grocery stores, and they can't even buy cars because inflation's through the roof. And in other words, Doocy didn't, and the media, as a rule with Biden, they don't try to debate the president. They've just been asking straight up questions. And I think that that's important, because that is the role of the media. But podcast listeners, we have a real treat for you. And that is, we're going to compare and contrast what you just heard with the classic Donald Trump press conference in 2020. It didn't matter. It could have been 2018. It would have mattered. 2017, 2016, 2019. We just pulled one out randomly. And listen to the contrast between how people ask questions of Biden, and Biden doesn't answer them, and how the media tries to debate the president and establish facts without actually asking a question and trying to appear unbiased. Well, we have a clip, and it's a classic Donald Trump clip. You're going to love it. It's short, but it kind of makes you long a little bit for the days of honesty in the White House. And by honesty, I mean not saying off mic, you're an SOB, but pretty much saying it on mic, right to your face. We have that clip, and here it is.
That you bought yourself some time and you didn't use it to prepare hospitals. You didn't use it to ramp up testing. Right now,
you're so disgraceful. It's so disgraceful the way you said it.
What did you do with the time that you bought?
Look. You know you're a fake. You know that. Your whole network, the way you cover it, is fake. We've done this right, and we really have done this right. The problem is the press doesn't cover it the way it should be.
So there you have it. What a contrast, right? A compare and contrast from Peter Doocy asking Biden and just straight up saying, well, can I ask you a question about inflation, Mr. President? And he's like, no, you can't ask that question. Stupid SOB. Off. He doesn't want Ducey to hear it. We still heard it anyway because it was on mic, even though he thought it was otherwise. As compared to Trump, who didn't even bother to care whether he went off mic. He wanted you to know that you were being corrupt with your questions because you're debating me. You have a media we have the first pandemic in 100 years in 2020. And that is when that question took place with that reporter. Where the reporter's like, well, I mean, you talked about testing and obviously there's not enough testing. And clearly, keep in mind, podcast listeners, in 2020, we had to, as a country, invent the tests. There were no such tests because we hadn't had a pandemic in 100 years. That's a lot different than fast forward today in 2022. And Trump's point there was just ask me a question and stop being like so argumentative that you're trying to debate me as if we're in some sort of high school civics contest and play the role of a reporter and ask a question. I want you to hear this again, just so you can see the compare and contrast. This is important. This is really important. We have that clip again. Here it is.
That you bought yourself some time and you didn't use it to prepare hospitals. You didn't use it to ramp up testing. Right now, nearly 20 million
you're so
people
disgraceful.
are unemployed.
It's so disgraceful the way you said it.
What did you do with the time that you bought?
Look. You know you're a fake. You know that your whole network, the way you cover it, is fake. We've done this right, and we really have done this right. The problem is the press doesn't cover it the way it should be.
So, the problem is the press really shouldn't cover this because you're a fake. You're a fake. And I think that the benefit of a Trump presidency in retrospect, at least as it relates to press conferences, is that for the first time, the American people heard a president call out the biased press and try to expose that biased press. And fast forward to 2022, we now have a press that's really behaving. Are they asking questions, including when Biden is having his own kind of staged format about a certain issue? Yes, they are. That's exactly what the press is supposed to be. Are they asking the questions that I think the American people want to finally hear? Yeah, I actually think that they are. Many of them, not all, but more than when Biden's first started. And I think it's important to understand this compare and contrast. And I think it was Trump who set into motion, hopefully, what is a somewhat healing period of the press where they understand that when you help another president like Biden get elected, and you literally don't ever ask him tough questions during the campaign, he gets elected and he's clearly not qualified to be the commander in chief because he's running the country into the ground. Maybe there's a teaching moment there, right? Maybe there's a teaching moment for the press. And I wanted to play that compare and contrast for you between those two press conferences because it illuminates a lot of the stuff that we've known for a while, that the press is fundamentally dishonest. But also, I'm hopeful that the press finally gets it and that increasingly people will understand how badly we need a press that is free and honest and straightforward. So next up, podcast listeners, the media gives the new governor of Virginia, Governor Youngkin, the DeSantis treatment. So as you guys know, the governor of Florida, DeSantis, he constantly is being attacked by the mainstream left-wing media, such as the Washington Post and the New York Times and the LA Times. You name the newspaper, you name the newscaster. But now we have a Virginia governor who is a Republican. And he appears to, at least at the beginning so far, appears to be governing as a conservative. And so there's this Hill piece titled, "Virginia's Youngkin Gets the DeSantis Treatment from the Media." He hasn't been in office for even a week, but Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, Republican, is already getting the same treatment from some corners of the media that his Republican counterpart in Florida regularly attracts. Quote, "So much for the silly narrative that Youngkin has some normal R," wrote Washington Post columnist Jen Rubin to her nearly 650,000 Twitter followers. In other words, she's saying so much for the idea that he's actually a normal Republican. And and by the way, she's a writer. She's like one of their key writers at the Washington Post, Jennifer Rubin. As Terry McAuliffe predicted, she said, he's brought DeSantis anti-mask nuttery to Virginia. Now at war with several school districts, he's only been in office a few days. Hey, Virginia, this is what you voted for. Best of luck. This is a writer for the Washington Post tweeting this out. And podcast listeners, if you recall, at the very beginning of the pandemic, in Florida, DeSantis gave parents 3 options. If you're a parent that is really concerned about people that live with you, like parents and grandparents, and you don't want your child to go to school, then your child can learn remotely exclusively. If you're a parent who wants your child to be in school because you don't have those same concerns, then you can send your child to school full-time in person. And Florida had a third option. You could do a hybrid of remote and in person. And of course, the interesting thing is about Jen Rubin in the Washington Post is they're still attacking DeSantis. And now they're trying to connect Youngkin to DeSantis because I think their thought process is that, Youngkin isn't smart enough to figure out how to give parents options for school because parents ought to be in charge. I mean, we started out this podcast about talking about how parents aren't in charge in schools when it comes to teachers teaching them how to be transgender and encouraging them to do so. And then we have a governor of Virginia and Florida who are empowering parents. Literally, that is why Youngkin got elected, because he's trying to empower parents. He's trying to get them back in charge of their schools, to take back the schools and let the teachers' unions know the parents are in charge, not you. You guys are employees of the system. We're happy that you want to teach, and we're glad that you want to teach. We're thankful. But at the end of the day, you work for us. And we're in charge of the children, not you. And so Jen Rubin, of course, who cares? Washington Post columnist, she has to attack Youngkin. And podcast listeners, I have a take on why that is. And you want to know why? Because Glenn Youngkin got elected in a state that the Democrats thought was safely blue, number one. And number two, he got elected by a lot of people who were Democrats in that state. He had to have. But I know for a fact that he did, because when I was driving through Northern Virginia on a number of times during the election, particularly the last few months, there were Youngkin signs all over the place in the most liberal parts of Northern Virginia, because parents don't like it when you mess with their children. And that was always the issue the Democrats controlled. They always controlled the teachers' unions, and the teachers' unions always controlled the Democrats, still do. And the Democrats thought, well, just naturally, because we are the party of education, that we're always going to get the vote of the moms who have children in public schools. Youngkin broke that. And now that he's done that, here's where I'm heading. Now that Youngkin has done that, and he's proven that he can govern as a conservative in a purple state, it is highly likely, mark my words, it is highly likely that you're going to see DeSantis choose Youngkin as his running mate when he runs for president. You're going to see DeSantis running for president, and you're going to see Youngkin on his ticket as his Veep. Because Youngkin can talk the talk and walk the walk about public education, and DeSantis can too about educational freedom, which is, Florida is literally an innovation education state. It's literally a state that is innovating in education because they keep growing the school choice movement. And it has started in minority communities and in poor communities, white, black, Hispanic, to give those individuals an opportunity to get up and out, to give those individuals an equal opportunity, not an equal outcome, but an equal opportunity. And that's a good thing. So the article continues, Governor Youngkin is already proving himself to be a Trump in fleece clothing, lamented monthly magazine contributor editor Ann Kim. This is not my Virginia. What? I mean, it's so stupid. Do they not listen to the citizens of the state as to why he got in there? So it continues. What makes Glenn Youngkin different from other GOP govs who banned mask mandates is the timing. Amid the most infectious variant yet, as record numbers of kids are being hospitalized and staffing shortages are crippling schools, argued NBC's Heidi Prisbilla. Of course, she's lying naturally because you don't have record numbers of children being hospitalized. Although it didn't stop the head of the CDC from lying about it until she was corrected. Quote, "Hi there, Arlington County parent here. Don't believe you are at Glenn Youngkin, but correct me if I am wrong," because they're asking if this is really his Twitter account. "Thank you to APS Virginia for standing up for our kids, teachers, and administrators and their safety in the midst of a transmissible variant," wrote White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki about Youngkin and to Youngkin. And despite Virginia's exit poll showing that just 1 in 10 parents say parents should have little or no say over what schools teach, I got to read that again. Believe it or not, there's a Virginia exit poll that occurred during the Youngkin gubernatorial campaign. So parents voted, and as they were walking out, that's an exit poll, they are polled to the extent that they want to answer the question. And they're asked the question, do you think parents should have little say or complete say about what schools teach? And apparently, there is a Virginia exit poll that shows that 1 in 10 parents say parents should have little or no say. So one parent actually came out and said, "Oh, no, I don't want to have any say in what my kids are learning." I mean, I want to meet that parent. I'm guessing it's probably a teachers union operative, because I don't think any sane parent would make such a statement. So despite that exit poll, we get headlines like this one from a Washington Post opinion piece, quote, "In catering to selfish parents, Youngkin is failing Virginia's kids." The guy just started in office a couple of weeks ago. And already the media establishment, the fake media establishment, which is centered in the Washington, D.C. area, you can't get faker and more dishonest than that. They're attacking Youngkin because they are terrified of a Republican winning suburban moms over the importance of education and parental say in what their children learn. To kick off his first week in office, the article continues, Youngkin, through executive orders, is simply carrying out his campaign promises, including listening to parents and allowing them to have a say in education, banning the teaching of critical race theory in schools, declaring that children should be in school in person 5 days a week. And if parents choose to mask their children or not mask them, it should be their choice. If Psaki wants to mask her children, that's fine. If another parent doesn't want to mask their child, that's fine too. Look at the science and data. Dozens of studies have shown that schools are safer than almost any other public facility, and most children who contract COVID-19 are not at risk of experiencing serious health issues. During his inaugural address, Youngkin also declared his intention to eliminate the Commonwealth's sales tax on groceries. Interesting, huh? That they even have a tax on groceries. Rather regressive, by the way. That's my opinion. It's also a fact, he also called for more aid for local police departments. And in an attempt to unify, he also wants to increase teacher pay, which progressives are pushing, and reduction of pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. And so Youngkin wants to eliminate taxes, sales taxes on groceries. Obviously, who does that hurt the most? It hurts the poor. And now that we have inflation that's out of control, it's actually a really good idea. A really good idea. Agree or disagree with Youngkin, he's governing as a campaign. But some corners of the press simply aren't happy about him sticking to his guns. Quote, Republicans love to say Youngkin is the example of a new Republican. What does he do first? Encourages kids to go to school without a mask. Kids will die. See, same old Republican, wrote CNN's Joe Lockhart. who's, by the way, a Democrat operative, used to work for Bill Clinton, but naturally he works for CNN now as a journalist, who was a former press secretary for Bill Clinton. Quote, but at least white and suburban parents can rest easy knowing their infected child won't be reading Toni Morrison's novels. Daily Beat columnist Wajahat Ali tweeted, white supremacy, self-destructive as always. Can you imagine? They're calling Youngkin a white supremacist because he wants parents to be in charge of their children and have a say in the curriculum. The unhinged vitriol is unlike the treatment of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. So in other words, the unhinged vitriol is very similar to that lashed out at Florida Governor DeSantis, who has also been accused of killing people of his state. Youngkin and DeSantis have a similar perspective on education. DeSantis opposes mandates for masks. He opposes critical race theory in schools and on learning to live with COVID instead of looking down from it. That has resulted in DeSantis attracting lots of negative national attention. Quote, Florida now has America's lowest COVID rate. Does Ron DeSantis deserve credit? One number to consider when answering that question, nearly as many Floridians, 21,000, have died in the last 4 months as in all of 2020, 23,000 people. Even though we have vaccines now, a Yahoo News national correspondent reported, without mentioning that the U.S. as a whole has had more deaths in 2021 with vaccines than in 2020 without them. This is how crazy the media is. And I'm so glad we played that compare and contrast of Biden and Trump earlier in this podcast with the press corps. It's brilliant, right? Because we can actually see now how a president is running the country into the ground and the press is still being kind and asking tough questions, but they're not trying to debate them like they did with the previous president. Quote, to reiterate, it's about to be illegal in Florida to make white people sad. Fix it, Jesus. Are they going to arrest comedians who tell jokes that hurt white patrons' feelings? Let white Floridians sue screenwriters who write white villains. Will there be book and movie bans? Unreal, MSNBC primetime host Joy Reid wrote. So, podcast listeners, Florida has comedy clubs across the state. And if you want to hear jokes about anything and everything under the sun, making fun of any group, no holds barred comedy, which is the purpose of comedy, right? No PC comedy. Florida is the place to go. The place that you're not going to hear comedy, actual comedy, is California. Clearly, you're not going to. You're not even going to be allowed to speak that way because you will be canceled. And yet, Joy Reid wrote, I have to read this again. Joy Reid of MSNBC, their primetime host, by the way, she writes, quote, to reiterate, it's about to be illegal in Florida to make white people sad. Fix it, Jesus. Are they going to arrest comedians who tell jokes that hurt white patrons' feelings? Let white Floridians sue screenwriters who write white villains? Will there be book and movie bans? Unreal. So when I read this, the thing that comes to mind, podcast listeners, is how dangerous this kind of language is in the United States of America, especially for a so-called mainstream media program. It's so dangerous because people watch this woman, Joy Reid, and they listen to her and they're being ginned up. The race war that she is ginning up is just disgusting. It is just disgusting. It is actually quite frightening because you can always assume what Joy Reid says is the complete opposite of what is actually happening. Because in Florida, they have this robust economy and they have this free speech policy and they have freedom of choice and education, all of the stuff that a free society should have nationwide. And here she is talking about Florida instead of the lockdown states of Illinois and New York and California, where kids have lost 2 years of their lives and 2 years of education, and they're still doubling down on vaccine passports, and they're still doubling down on mask mandates, and they're still doubling down on anything that they can to try to maintain control that they received under these emergency orders. Here's another one. Quote, I have studied Hitler and how he got to power, Florida gubernatorial challenger Nikki Friedde shared during a recent interview when asked if she was comparing arguably the worst mass murderer in human history to the sitting governor of Florida. I mean, she is going to challenge Nikki Friedde. I mean, it's Fried, so it could be fried. Who knows? Her brain's fried, that's for sure. So let's call her that. Nikki Fried Brain. She literally is going to run against DeSantis. She is the Democrat chosen one in Florida. And says, I have studied Hitler and how he got to power. Florida gubernatorial challenger Nikki Friedde shared during a recent interview when asked if she was comparing arguably the worst mass murder in human history to the sitting governor of the Sunshine State. You get the idea. If you're Youngkin or DeSantis, because of the letter R next to your name, you become a target of some of the most hyperbolic and reckless rhetoric and reporting out there. But if you're like, let's say, Governor Gretchen Half-Whitmer of Democrat of Michigan, or Governor Gavin Pretty Boy Newsom of California, only a fraction of the same hostility and scrutiny applies, despite how badly their states are faring in every aspect. And the most important one, of course, being freedom of education and freedom of speech. The most important freedoms, other than, of course, or I should say, in addition to the right of this Second Amendment. Let's go there, right? That's equally important. Either way, the governors of Virginia and Florida aren't going away soon. They may even contend for the Oval Office one day. That's exactly what I think, podcast listeners. And perhaps that prospect is what's really fueling the attacks against them. And this article is written by Joe Koncha, who is a writer for The Hill, and he's sometimes a guest host on various newscasts. But he wrote this, and it's quite brilliant because this is precisely what is happening. Youngkin is such a threat to the educational monopoly the Democrats have. And watch me, podcast listeners, I know this is true. DeSantis is going to choose him as his running mate when DeSantis finally announces that he's going to run. And obviously, you know, Trump wants to run too. I mean, we all know that. Will Trump run? Won't Trump run? I don't know. I have no idea. I will say this, though. DeSantis and Youngkin, that's a pretty strong combination. Two great thinkers and two guys who, at least so far, are putting policy where their mouth is. It's not just talk, they're putting the policy in place. Also, speaking of Virginia, Virginia scraps CRT program, critics said would have destroyed math education. So, podcast listeners, when you think of CRT, critical race theory, what you think of is teaching children to judge one another by the way they look, right? Rather than by the content of their character. Well, that is CRT in a nutshell. But in Virginia, they were using CRT to get rid of gifted and talented programs in math. And so in the Daily Caller, a state plan to abolish teaching advanced math in public schools that was seen as a means of implementing critical race theory was canceled Monday, according to a parents' group. So again, it was a state plan prior to Youngkin being elected to abolish advanced math at a time when we need literally millions of experts in math and science in the modern era. I mean, look, we can all complain about California and we can really take our hits on California, but one thing is undeniable, and that is in the Silicon Valley area, centered around Stanford, between the public school system, the private school system, and the ecosystem that they created there. They created the most vibrant and changing companies, in my opinion, in world history, and are still doing it. And that is rooted in education. Okay. Now, California is wrecking all that now, as we know, because of all this woke crazy stuff. But why would you try to wreck math and get rid of gifted and talented programs? Well, because it's not equity, right? Because equity means you can't have any kind of merit. No, you must get rid of merit. You must have a quality of outcome. So the Virginia Department of Education, VDOE, has shut down the Virginia Math Pathways Initiative, according to a message that flashed briefly on the website before taking people to the main mathematics instruction page on the Virginia Department of Education site. Parents Defending Education said, quote, "The Virginia Department of Education has ended the Virginia Math Pathways Initiative project. Please see the mathematics instruction page if your browser does not refresh." The message on the site reads, "Parents groups have criticized this getting rid of the exceptional math programs, claiming it was part of an agenda by those pushing CRT, according to an April 2021 report by the Daily Wire, which of course it was. Quote, "Ideologues of critical race theory, including Ibram X. Kendi, target advanced education, including math and advanced diploma programs, as emblematic of systemic racism, and thus they are being targeted by activists around the country for elimination," Parents Defending Education said on its website. CRT holds that America is fundamentally racist, yet teaches people to view every social interaction and person in terms of race, and whose adherents pursue anti-racism through the end of merit, objective truth, and the adoption of race-based policies. And so good for you, Governor Youngkin, for restoring excellence in math, for bringing back programs that really challenge students who have exceptional abilities in math, and rewarding merit, rewarding objective truth, and getting rid of this crazy notion that because of the way someone looks, they can't excel in math. It's so stupid. It's so stupid. The idea that someone, simply because they have black or brown skin, can't excel in math? I mean, it's just ridiculous. And at the same time, of course, you have, Harvard and some of the other Ivy Leagues limiting the number of Asians that can come in because, for whatever reason, the Asian community excels at math and science and they not only do extraordinarily well in high school, but they do extraordinarily well on these standardized tests like the SAT. And by all stretches of merit, they should be allowed into these great colleges, and they're not. They're not. And it's so funny to me because you've got Harvard and Yale as examples who are all about CRT, but they don't want too many Asians in their school. It's such a classic. It's such a classic thing. I mean, you just got to laugh all the way. But here's the thing, podcast listeners. The takeaway here is Glenn Youngkin is trying to right the ship in the state of Virginia. And mark my words, in 1 year's time, you're going to see, if not sooner, you're going to see DeSantis and Youngkin together, not necessarily campaigning, but, having a meeting and talking about stuff and comparing notes. And then that will set the course for the 2024 election. And in my opinion, we're going to have a DeSantis for president, and he will be the president, and we're going to have a Youngkin as vice president. Actually, that's what I think is going to happen. And again, the spoiler here is Donald Trump. Will he run? Won't he run? I don't know. Who knows what Donald Trump's going to do in the meantime? Certainly, he can't wait to take out Liz Cheney and others. But that's a whole nother story. Well, in any event, I really appreciate you guys being with us. This podcast again, Trans Indoctrination. And please go online and comment and check out, again, this slide that we talked about earlier about cisgender privilege activity. You have to see this because it is a real slide from my own public school system in my county. And that's it from Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.